Today we're going to be starting on the last section of Chapter 2 about making informed decisions. And so what we're going to do is we're going to describe 3 values that people consider when making decisions. We're going to talk about a decision-making model that we can use so that we can try and be as objective as possible. And we're going to be looking at the short-term and long-term consequences of the decisions in a hypothetical situation. So this is Roman numeral 4A. Other factors besides scientific research must be considered when solving environmental problems. Environmental problems tend to be controversial in some cases, and so you have to have a way to discuss them that includes every possible angle, not just from a scientific point of view. B, values are the principles or standards considered important by people and must be considered when making decisions about the environment. C, some questions that must be considered can include, number 1, how will the proposed solution affect people's lives? So in other words, is it going to cause people to get sick or get well? Is it going to cost so much money that people can't afford it? So there's a lot of things that you have to consider in this particular question. Number 2, how much will the solution cost? If the cost is prohibitive, it may be that you have to figure out a different solution because of cost concerns. And number 3, is the solution ethical? This is one that is a real touchy subject for some people. Ethical doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong, but it also may mean doing something because it's the right thing to do, not just because it's the easiest thing to do. D, values to be considered include, number 1, aesthetic. In other words, is it pleasing? Is it enjoyable? Is it something that people would like? There is value in things simply because they are to be enjoyed, not just because there is a monetary value to them. Number 2, economic. What's going to happen if you have to deal with the cost of this particular solution? Number 3, environmental. How is this solution going to affect the environment? Number 4, educational. Is there educational value to what is going on? Now, one thing you have to remember is every one of these values may not be considered every time. Number 5, ethical or moral. It may be okay to some people to cause a species to become endangered, but is it the ethical thing to do? Number 6, health. Is this solution going to cause health issues, or is it going to improve health issues? Number 7, recreational. Having space for recreation is important for well-being. Number 8, scientific. Does it have scientific value? And number 9, social and cultural, which we have talked about before. Now, like I said, you may not have every one of these every time you have to consider a solution. Most of the time, there'll be 2 or 3 of these that you really, really want to focus on when you're looking at a solution. And we're going to be using these in part of our example in a minute. E, one way to do this is to use a decision-making model. Now, the point of using a model is that it helps to remove some of the bias that we might have considered or that might be there that we didn't realize. This is a conceptual model that provides a systematic process for making decisions. In other words, it helps them to be a little more subjective. Remember, a conceptual model is a verbal explanation a drawing or a diagram that shows how a system works or is organized. This is from earlier in the chapter. F, one possible conceptual model for decision making could be this right here, this chart. Now let's talk about it for a minute. First of all, the very first step in making the decision is you have to gather information so that you've got a way to make a decision. The second step is decide which values you're going to consider while doing this. And those are the ones we just mentioned, those 9 we just mentioned. Like I said, usually you don't include all 9. You could, but most of the time you would only pick 2 or 3. Then you explore the consequences. You look at both the short-term consequences and the long-term consequences, or another word for consequences would be results of that solution. And then once you have done all of that, then you make a decision based on all of those things. G, when gathering information, several sources of information should be considered. In other words, don't get all your information from just one place, because that one place may have bias. Number 1, news reports. And it would probably be helpful if you had news reports from more than one source. Number 2, articles from newspapers, magazines, and books. And checking about the reliability of a particular newspaper, magazine, and book would also be helpful. And number 3, talk to people on all sides of the issue. In other words, you're not going to be able to make an informed decision if you only talk to people who agree on every point. It's helpful to talk to people who don't agree on every point, because it allows you to see the whole thing from more than one side. H, when considering the consequences, there are several types. Number 1, short-term positive consequences. This means some result that's going to be positive that's going to happen very quickly or very soon after the decision. Number 2, short-term negative consequences. So if you're trying to make a decision about where to put a landfill, then, for instance, a short-term positive consequence would be you have a new landfill that isn't going to be full for a long time. A short-term negative consequence would be people not being happy because you're putting it right beside their property. Number 3, long-term positive consequences. It means now you're not going to have to find another landfill for 30 or 40 or maybe 50 years. That would be a long-term positive consequence. And number 4, a long-term negative consequence would be that you will be affecting the environment in that local area. Building the landfill is going to mess up ecosystems that were already in place, and they may not recover. So, in other words, there's short-term positive and negative, and there's long-term positive and negative results or consequences for every decision. And when you look at all of them, it helps you to figure out which is the best solution. Letter I, all 4 types of consequence should be determined for each value before making the decision. All right, so for example, a major company is dumping toxic chemicals into a local water supply. So what do you think the solution to the problem is? All right, what's going to happen is I'm going to give you a piece of paper in a minute that you're going to work on in your groups, your lab groups, and all this information that I'm putting up here right now is on the piece of paper. Here's some additional information. The company says that if they're forced to clean up the water supply, they will close and move to a country with less restrictions. This company is the largest employer in town. So how does this change your solution once you have this additional information? So what you're going to be doing is listing one positive and one negative result of allowing the plant to continue, and one positive and one negative result of closing the plant. Not this second, but once you get the handout, you will be doing all of this. Now, here is what the handout looks like. All of the same thing I just got through saying is in this top part. So you're going to use the decision-making process we just talked about to try and find a solution to the problem. So you're going to fill in the chart below. Here were the first two steps in the decision-making process. You're going to gather information, and this step has already been done. It's included in those paragraphs. Okay? Then you're going to pick two of these values that you think apply to this situation, and you're going to list them right here in the table and right here in the table, those two values. Then you're going to write a positive short-term consequence for the first value and a negative short-term, and a positive long-term and a negative long-term. You're going to repeat that process for the second value. Now, if you feel very strongly that there's a third one you want to include, you are welcome to do it over here, but it isn't required. Now, you're going to turn over to the back of the paper, and here is what you're going to do. There are several solutions listed below, so discuss the consequences in the table with your group, and then pick which solution you think is the best one. You may also pick one that isn't included here, and you can write it by letter E right here. The last thing you're going to do is list your decision below and tell why your group picked that decision. The last thing that's going to happen today is that you're going to get a test review guide, because the test for this chapter is the next time I see you, and that's also when your homework is due, so you need to make sure that you have that with you the next time you come in.